January 25, 2024. William C. Holman Correctional Facility, Atmore, Alabama. Kenneth Eugene Smith has 24 hours to live. But Kenneth Smith is different from every other death row inmate in America. Kenneth already survived one execution. On November 17, 2022, Alabama strapped him to a gurney and spent hours stabbing needles into his arms, hands, and collarbone, trying to find a vein for lethal injection. They stuck him over and over like a freaking sewing machine, in Smith's own words, making him cry out for help while nobody helped. After 4 hours of torture, they gave up at midnight. The execution failed. Smith became one of only 2 people in modern American history to survive an execution attempt. Now 14 months later, Alabama is trying again. But this time, they're not using lethal injection. This time, they're using something that's never been done before in human history: nitrogen hypoxia. They're going to strap a mask to Smith's face and pump pure nitrogen gas into his lungs until he suffocates from lack of oxygen. No state, no country, no jurisdiction anywhere in the world has ever executed someone this way. Kenneth Smith is about to become the first person in history to die by nitrogen gas. Medical experts say it could be torture. The UN says it might be cruel and inhuman. Even veterinarians won't use nitrogen to euthanize mammals because it's too distressing. But Alabama is doing it anyway. And in 24 hours, we'll all find out what happens when you turn a human being into a guinea pig for an untested execution method. This is Kenneth Smith's final day, told from his cell to the chamber where he'll shake and writhe for 4 minutes while the world watches Alabama make history for all the wrong reasons. Before we follow Kenneth Smith into his final 24 hours and witness history's first nitrogen gas execution, subscribe to this channel right now. We document the most extreme prison stories and death row cases that expose how broken the system really is. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what you're about to see will change how you think about the death penalty forever. Now, let's go inside Kenneth Smith's last day on Earth. Kenneth Smith, age 58, sits in his death row cell at Holman Correctional Facility trying to control his breathing. He's been having panic attacks constantly since they scheduled his second execution date. Post-traumatic stress disorder from the first attempt haunts him every day. Smith closes his eyes, and he's back on that gurney in November 2022, strapped down, watching execution team members approach with needles. He feels the first needle go into his hand. Mississippi, try again. Mississippi, move to the arm. Mississippi, Mississippi, Mississippi. They're stabbing him repeatedly, hitting muscle instead of vein, the needles burning as they push through tissue searching for access to his bloodstream. "I was crying out for help," Smith told reporters later. "I was absolutely alone in a room full of people, and not one of them tried to help me at all." For 4 hours they stuck him. Arms, hands, collarbone, over and over. The death warrant expired at midnight. They had to stop. Smith was unstrapped and taken back to death row, traumatized but alive. His lawyers argued that attempting a second execution would violate the Constitution's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The courts disagreed. Alabama was allowed to try again. But this time, as part of a settlement, Alabama agreed not to use lethal injection. Instead, Smith would face nitrogen hypoxia, a method he'd previously suggested as an alternative. But that was before Alabama developed the actual protocol. Now, reading the details of how they'll suffocate him with nitrogen gas, Smith is absolutely terrified. March 18, 1988. Elizabeth Dorling Sennett, 45 years old, wife of a Church of Christ pastor, is found dead in her home in Colbert County, Alabama. She's been stabbed multiple times and beaten. The crime scene is staged to look like a burglary. But investigators discover the truth. Elizabeth's husband, Pastor Charles Sennett, hired 2 men to kill his wife so he could collect insurance money and hide his embezzlement from the church. Kenneth Smith and John Parker were paid $1,000 each to commit the murder. They entered Elizabeth's home, attacked her, and left her to die. Charles Sennett later killed himself when the plot was exposed. Smith and Parker were both arrested, both convicted. Parker was executed in 2010. Smith was sentenced to death, but his case was unusual. The jury voted 11-1 in favor of life imprisonment. But Alabama allowed judges to override jury recommendations, and the judge sentenced Smith to death anyway. That practice has since been outlawed nationwide, but Smith's sentence stands. For 36 years, he's been on death row for a murder-for-hire killing that a jury believed shouldn't result in execution. Now that execution is finally happening, using a method that's never been tried before. Nitrogen hypoxia isn't a medical term. It's a phrase Alabama invented for this execution. The concept: replace breathable air with pure nitrogen gas. Normally, air contains 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. Oxygen keeps us alive. Nitrogen is inert, harmless in normal concentrations. But breathe 100% nitrogen with zero oxygen, and your body is deprived of what it needs. According to Alabama, Smith will lose consciousness within seconds and die within minutes. Painless. Humane. The most painless method of execution known to man, according to the state attorney general. But medical experts strongly disagree. Dr. Joel Zivit, an anesthesiologist at Emory University, calls the method torture. Nitrogen hypoxia is the state's attempt to create credibility for a technique that's never been done before, he says. The problems: the mask might not seal properly, allowing Smith to breathe room air and prolonging his suffering. Smith might vomit into the mask and aspirate, drowning in his own vomit. The nitrogen might not render him unconscious quickly, forcing him to experience the terror of suffocation while fully aware. Even the American Veterinary Medical Association deemed nitrogen unacceptable for euthanizing mammals except pigs because it causes distress. But Alabama is using it on a human being. Kenneth Smith will be the test case, the guinea pig, the experiment. And nobody knows what will actually happen when they flip the switch and nitrogen starts flowing into his mask. 7 a.m., January 25, 2024. Kenneth Smith is moved from his regular death row cell to Death Watch, a special isolation area near the execution chamber. A corrections officer escorts him down the corridor, past other condemned men who watch silently, knowing Smith is walking toward something unprecedented. The Death Watch cell is stark: metal bunk, toilet, desk, observation window, where a guard sits continuously logging Smith's every movement. Smith sits on the bunk and stares at the wall. 17 hours until midnight. 17 hours until they strap that mask to his face and start the nitrogen flowing. Smith's hands are shaking. The PTSD from the first execution is overwhelming. He keeps flashing back to November 2022, feeling those needles stabbing into him repeatedly. Now he faces something potentially worse. The guard logs: 0700 hours. Smith transferred to Death Watch. Visible anxiety. Hands trembling. Smith tries to control his breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth. But his chest feels tight. Panic attack building. He forces himself to calm down. 17 hours. He has to survive 17 more hours of terror before they finally kill him. If they can. If the nitrogen works. If it doesn't, he'll be the man who survived 2 execution attempts, which might be worse than dying. At 8 a.m., Kenneth Smith's spiritual advisor, Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood, arrives at Holman Correctional Facility. Hood is a Baptist minister and fierce opponent of the death penalty who has witnessed multiple executions. But this one is different. Alabama has asked Hood to sign a waiver acknowledging that he might be at risk of harm from nitrogen gas exposure if he enters the execution chamber with Smith. The state admits they don't know if the nitrogen will stay contained in Smith's mask or leak into the chamber atmosphere. Hood signs the waiver anyway. He refuses to let Smith die alone. Hood sits outside Smith's death watch cell and they talk through the observation window. Smith is afraid. "Everybody is telling me I'm going to suffer," Smith tells Hood. "I'm absolutely terrified." Hood tries to provide comfort, talking about faith, about God's presence even in death, about how Smith won't be alone because Hood will be there until the very end. They pray together, Smith's voice breaking as he asks God for courage, for a quick death, for forgiveness, for Elizabeth Sennett's murder. Hood promises he'll stand right next to the gurney during the execution, hand on Smith's arm, providing human comfort while the state pumps nitrogen into his lungs. When Hood leaves, promising to return later, Smith feels slightly less alone. But only slightly. 16 hours left. In Sheffield, Alabama, Mike Sennett prepares to drive to Atmore to witness Kenneth Smith's execution. Mike was a young man when his mother Elizabeth was murdered 36 years ago. The crime shattered his family. His father Charles, the pastor who hired Smith and Parker to kill Elizabeth, committed suicide when the murder plot was exposed. Mike lost both parents to that crime. For 36 years, he's waited for justice. For 36 years, Smith has lived while Mike's mother stayed dead. Tonight, finally, that debt will be paid. Mike tells reporters he feels bittersweet about the execution. He's not celebrating. He's not jumping for joy. But he believes Smith needs to answer for what he did. Kenneth Smith made some bad decisions 36 years ago, and his debt will be paid tonight, Mike says. He doesn't care that it's nitrogen instead of lethal injection. He doesn't care that medical experts call it experimental. He just wants it done. Wants his mother's murder finally closed. Wants to say Elizabeth Dorling Sennett got her justice. Mike loads into his car with family members and begins the drive to Atmore. 3 hours until they arrive. 10 hours until the execution. Mike wonders if watching Smith die will bring the closure everyone promises. Or if he'll just feel empty, the way he's felt for 36 years. At noon, Kenneth Smith's attorneys receive word that their final appeals have been rejected. They filed motions arguing that nitrogen hypoxia constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. They argued that using an untested method after a failed execution attempt is unconstitutional double jeopardy. They argued that Smith will suffer, that the method is experimental, that Alabama is using him as a guinea pig. Every court rejected their arguments. The Alabama Supreme Court, the Federal District Court, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, the U.S. Supreme Court, all denied stays of execution. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote a dissent. Having failed to kill Smith on its first attempt, Alabama has selected him as its guinea pig to test a method of execution never attempted before. But her dissent didn't matter. The execution will proceed. Smith's attorneys call him with the news. There's nothing left. No more legal options. No more hope. Just 10 hours until they put that mask on his face. Smith thanks his lawyers for trying, for fighting for him for years, for treating him like a human being. When he hangs up, Smith sits in heavy silence. The system has spoken. He's going to die tonight, by a method no human has ever experienced. And there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. At 2 p.m., prison staff ask Smith what he wants for his last meal. Alabama doesn't have the same restrictions some states impose. Smith can request whatever he wants within reason. Smith orders a simple meal, T-bone steak, hash browns, and eggs. Not elaborate, not expensive, just comfort food. The meal arrives at 4 p.m. Smith looks at it for a long moment before eating. These are the last flavors he'll ever taste. The last food he'll ever eat. In 8 hours, his body will shut down from oxygen deprivation. Everything ends tonight. Smith cuts into the steak. It's cooked properly, surprisingly good for prison food. The hash browns are crispy. The eggs are scrambled perfectly. He eats mechanically, not really tasting anything despite the care in preparation. His mind is elsewhere, on the mask, on the nitrogen, on what those 4 minutes of shaking and writhing will feel like. Will he be unconscious, unaware, experiencing nothing? Or will he be conscious, terrified, feeling himself suffocate while unable to scream because of the mask? Nobody knows. Smith is the first. The test subject. The experiment. He finishes the meal and pushes the tray away. 8 hours left. 8 hours until history is made. 8 hours until Kenneth Smith becomes a statistic. The first person executed by nitrogen gas. Smith lies on his death watch bunk trying to meditate, a practice Reverend Hood taught him months ago. Focus on breath. In and out. Be present in the moment. Don't think about the future, about what's coming, about the mask and the nitrogen and the dying. Just breathe. But his mind won't cooperate. Every breath reminds him that in 6 hours, breathing will be what kills him. Nitrogen filling his lungs instead of oxygen. His body starving for air while nitrogen floods his mask. The panic builds again. Smith sits up, gasping. The guard outside logs his distress. 1,600 hours. Subject experiencing anxiety episode. Breathing rapidly. Smith forces himself to calm down. He's been having these panic attacks constantly since the second execution was scheduled. The PTSD from November 2022 combines with terror about tonight. He's trapped in a cycle of trauma and fear with no escape except death. 6 hours. He just has to survive 6 more hours of terror. Then it'll be over. One way or another. Tonight he dies. Either quickly by nitrogen or slowly by torture if the method fails. Smith prays the first scenario happens. Prays Alabama's untested method works exactly as they claim. Prays he loses consciousness in seconds and feels nothing. Because the alternative is too horrible to contemplate. Kenneth Smith has 6 hours left before Alabama attempts history's first nitrogen gas execution, after already torturing him in a failed lethal injection. This is real. This is happening. If this story is keeping you watching, hit that like button right now and drop a comment. Is using an untested execution method on someone who already survived one execution cruel and unusual punishment? Should Smith's life be spared? Keep watching as we follow Smith into the execution chamber, where everything goes exactly as bad as the medical experts predicted. At 6 p.m., Reverend Hood returns for his final visit with Smith before the execution. They have 4 hours left together. Hood sits outside the observation window, and they talk about everything except dying. Smith's childhood, his regrets, Elizabeth Sennett, and the weight of guilt he's carried for 36 years. I can't bring her back, Smith says quietly. I can't undo what I did. All I can do is face what's coming and hope it means something to her family. Hood reminds Smith that his jury voted 11-1 for life imprisonment. The judge overrode them, using a practice now illegal. You wouldn't be sentenced to death if this happened today, Hood says. But that doesn't change anything. The sentence stands. The execution proceeds. Hood and Smith pray together one last time. Smith's final prayers are simple, asking God for courage, for a quick death, for the nitrogen to work the way Alabama promises. He prays for Mike Sennett and Elizabeth's family, that watching him die brings them peace. He prays for Reverend Hood, who will stand beside the gurney and witness whatever horror is about to unfold. When they finish praying, Smith looks Hood in the eye. Thank you for not leaving me alone in this, Smith says. Thank you for being there. Hood promises, I won't leave you. I'll be right there until the very end. At 8 p.m., Alabama Department of Corrections Commissioner John Hamm visits Smith's death watch cell to explain the execution procedure. Hamm speaks in clinical detached tones, as though describing a medical procedure rather than state-sanctioned killing. At 11:30 p.m., you'll be moved to the execution chamber. You'll be strapped to the gurney. A mask will be placed over your face, sealed tightly. At approximately midnight, pure nitrogen gas will begin flowing into the mask at a high rate. You should lose consciousness within seconds. Death will occur within minutes. The nitrogen will flow for approximately 15 minutes, total to ensure completion. Smith asks the question that's haunted him. What if I don't lose consciousness? What if I'm aware the whole time? Ham's professional mask slips slightly. We've designed the protocol to prevent that. The nitrogen concentration will be 100%. You won't be able to breathe oxygen. Unconsciousness should be rapid. Should. That word. Should. Not will. Not guaranteed. Should. Smith's lawyers, medical experts, the UN human rights organizations, they've all said this method is risky, untested, potentially torture. But Alabama is doing it anyway. After Ham leaves, Smith sits alone with his terror. 2 hours until they come for him. 2 hours until history's first nitrogen gas execution. 2 hours until Kenneth Smith becomes the answer to a trivia question. Who was the first person executed by nitrogen hypoxia? And what will the follow-up question be? Did he suffer? By 9 p.m., media witnesses begin arriving at Holman Correctional Facility. Reporters from major outlets NPR, CBS, NBC, Associated Press gather in a designated area. They've come to document history. The first nitrogen gas execution. They've come with notebooks and pens, prohibited from bringing cameras or recording devices. They'll have to describe what they see with words alone. Lee Hedgepeth, a reporter who has witnessed multiple Alabama executions, stands with his notebook ready. He doesn't know what to expect. Nobody does. This is unprecedented. Alabama officials have assured everyone the execution will be quick and humane. But Hedgepeth remembers other Alabama executions that went wrong. He's skeptical. In a separate area, Mike Sennett and Elizabeth Sennett's family members arrive as victim witnesses. They're escorted to a holding area where they'll wait until it's time to enter the witness room. Mike's hands are shaking slightly. 36 years building to this moment. His mother's murder finally being avenged. But seeing a man die, even a man who killed your mother, is traumatic. Mike wonders if he's ready for what he's about to witness. At 10 p.m., prison officials brief all witnesses on protocols. No talking during the execution, no demonstrative reactions, no leaving until it's completed. The curtain will open at midnight. Kenneth Smith will be on the gurney. And then the nitrogen will flow. At 11:30 p.m., guards come for Kenneth Smith. It's time, they say simply. Smith stands on legs that barely support him. This is it. The moment he's been dreading for 14 months since the first failed execution. The moment he's been terrified of for 24 hours. The moment that ends his life. Guards place Smith in handcuffs and walk him down a short corridor from death watch to the execution chamber. Reverend Hood walks beside him, hand on Smith's shoulder, murmuring prayers. The walk takes less than a minute, but feels eternal. Smith enters the execution chamber. It's a small room, maybe 15 by 20 feet, with pale walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. The gurney dominates the center, black padding with multiple leather straps hanging ready. Along one wall, windows looking into 3 separate witness rooms, currently covered by curtains. The execution team, corrections officers in standard uniforms, waits silently. "Lie down, please," an officer instructs. Smith complies, lying on the gurney. His heart is pounding, so hard he can hear it in his ears. The officers work quickly. Chest strap across his torso, waist strap, arm straps extending his arms out to the sides, leg straps. Within 90 seconds, Smith is completely immobilized. He can barely move his head, can't move his limbs at all. He's helpless, at the mercy of the state. The nitrogen mask waits on a table beside the gurney. It looks like a scuba diving mask or fighter pilot oxygen mask, covering nose and mouth, with straps to hold it tight to the face. Smith stares at it with pure terror in his eyes. At 11:45 p.m., the execution team approaches with the nitrogen mask. Reverend Hood stands at Smith's left side, hand resting on Smith's arm, the only human comfort available. An execution team member lifts the mask and brings it towards Smith's face. Smith's breathing accelerates. Panic. The mask comes closer, covers his nose and mouth. The straps are tightened around his head, pulling the mask seal tight against the skin. Smith is breathing rapidly into the mask, hyperventilating from fear. The mask feels suffocating even before the nitrogen starts. Claustrophobic, tight, terrifying. In the witness rooms, curtains open. Media witnesses on one side see Kenneth Smith strapped to the gurney with a mask covering his face. Mike Sennett and victim family members on another side see the man who murdered Elizabeth. Official witnesses in a third room document everything. Everyone waits. Commissioner Ham stands at the head of the gurney. He asks Smith if he has final words. Smith speaks through the mask, voice muffled. Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backward. I'm leaving with love, peace, and light. Thank you for supporting me. Love all of you. Smith makes an I love you sign with his fingers in sign language, one of the few movements he can still make while strapped down. Then he takes what he believes will be his final breaths of oxygen. Ham signals the execution team. Behind a wall, an operator prepares to open the nitrogen valve. At exactly midnight, January 25, 2024, Kenneth Eugene Smith's execution begins. History is made. The nitrogen flows. Midnight. The nitrogen valve opens. Pure nitrogen gas floods into Kenneth Smith's mask at high pressure, replacing the oxygen he needs to breathe. According to Alabama, Smith should lose consciousness within seconds. His body should shut down quickly and peacefully. That's not what happens. For the first minute, Smith breathes the nitrogen. His eyes are open, looking around the room. He's still conscious, fully aware. The medical experts were right. The transition isn't instantaneous. Smith's body realizes it's not getting oxygen. Panic response kicks in. Then it begins. Smith's body starts shaking. Violent shaking. His torso jerks against the chest strap. His head pulls back. His arms strain against the restraints. His legs move involuntarily. Witnesses in the media room are horrified. Lee Hedgepeth watches in shock. I have witnessed 5 executions in Alabama, he'll say later, and I have never seen such a violent reaction. Smith is convulsing, shaking and writhing on the gurney. His fingers clench into fists. His body arches against the straps. This continues for a full 4 minutes. For minutes of visible struggling. For minutes of Smith's body fighting for oxygen that isn't there. For minutes that witnesses will describe as disturbing, violent, nothing like what Alabama promised. Reverend Hood stands frozen, hand still on Smith's arm, feeling the violent shaking, watching his friend suffer exactly the way the medical experts predicted. The struggling continues. Smith's body writhes on the gurney for 4 full minutes. Then the violent shaking stops. But Smith isn't dead. His chest starts heaving, heavy breathing, gasping, his body desperately trying to pull oxygen from air that contains none. The gasping continues for several more minutes. Witnesses watch as Smith's chest rises and falls in exaggerated movements. He appears to be fighting for air, suffocating, experiencing exactly what critics feared. Conscious awareness of oxygen starvation. Mike Sennett watches from the victim witness room. This isn't the quick, peaceful death Alabama promised. This is suffering. Visible, undeniable suffering. Mike's expression shows conflict. This man killed his mother, but watching him die like this is disturbing. In the media witness room, reporters document everything. Marty Roney writes, Kenneth Smith convulsed for 4 minutes in Alabama death chamber. The language is clinical, but the horror is clear. This execution is not going as planned. At approximately 12 minutes after midnight, Smith's movements finally slow. The gasping becomes less pronounced. His chest movements weaken. The nitrogen has been flowing for 12 minutes. Smith is finally dying. But he's dying after minutes of visible struggle, after convulsing violently, after gasping desperately for air, after suffering in ways Alabama swore wouldn't happen. At 8:25 p.m., 22 minutes after midnight, 32 minutes after the curtains opened, Smith is pronounced dead. History's first nitrogen gas execution is complete. And it was every bit as horrific as the critics predicted. At 8:25 p.m., 12:25 a.m. execution time, a prison physician enters the chamber and checks Kenneth Smith for vital signs. Stethoscope to chest, no heartbeat. Check for breathing, nothing. Pupil response test, none. The physician makes the official pronouncement. I declare this inmate deceased. Time of death, 8:25 p.m. Kenneth Eugene Smith is dead. The first person in human history executed by nitrogen hypoxia. The curtains close on the witness rooms. Witnesses are escorted out separately. Media witnesses head to a press area where they'll file reports. Mike Sennett and the victim family are taken to a separate area. Prison officials hold a press conference. Commissioner Ham defends the execution. Nitrogen hypoxia is the most painless and humane method of execution known to man. There was some expected involuntary movement. Everything proceeded according to protocol. Reporters push back. What about the 4 minutes of convulsing? What about the gasping? How is that painless and humane? Ham deflects. The movements were involuntary. He was unconscious. He felt nothing. But witnesses aren't convinced. They saw what they saw. Lee Hedgepeth tells reporters, "It was the most violent reaction to an execution I've ever witnessed." Alabama insists everything went perfectly. The witnesses describe something very different. Kenneth Smith suffered, visibly, undeniably, for minutes. The first nitrogen gas execution in history was exactly what critics warned: experimental torture of a human being. 4 months after Kenneth Smith's execution, his autopsy results are analyzed by medical experts. The findings are damning. Smith exhibited signs of negative pressure pulmonary edema, fluid in the lungs caused by the desperate attempt to breathe against resistance. His blood was dark maroon, consistent with oxygen deprivation. His lungs showed marked congestion and frothy fluid in his trachea. The autopsy confirms what witnesses observed. Smith suffered. Dr. Brian McAlery, an anesthesiologist hired to review the autopsy for another Alabama death row inmate scheduled for nitrogen execution, calls the results highly concerning. McAlery's expert analysis. Smith likely panicked due to an automatic response to the inability to breathe oxygen. The violent convulsions witnesses saw weren't involuntary movements, as Alabama claimed. They were Smith's body in panic, fighting desperately for air. McAlery notes that Smith's panic could have been avoided if he'd been given a sedative before the execution. But Alabama refused. They wanted Smith conscious when the nitrogen started flowing so he could give final words. That decision ensured Smith would experience the full terror of suffocation. The autopsy proves the critics were right. Nitrogen hypoxia, as Alabama implemented it, was torture. Cruel. Inhumane. Experimental suffering inflicted on a human being. Kenneth Smith's 4 minutes of violent convulsing weren't side effects. They were agony. Kenneth Eugene Smith is dead. The first person executed by nitrogen hypoxia. But his death didn't end the controversy. It ignited it. The United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, issued a statement. "I deeply regret the execution of Kenneth Eugene Smith despite serious concerns. This novel and untested method of suffocation by nitrogen gas may amount to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. The death penalty is inconsistent with the fundamental right to life." The European Union condemned the execution as particularly cruel and unusual punishment. Human rights organizations called it state-sponsored torture. But Alabama didn't care. They declared the execution successful. For months after Smith's execution, Alabama killed Alan Eugene Miller by nitrogen gas. Then Carrie Dale Grayson. Then Demetrius Terrence Frazier. Alabama is building an execution assembly line using nitrogen hypoxia. Oklahoma and Mississippi are watching. If Alabama can do it, they'll do it too. Kenneth Smith's legacy is being the guinea pig. The test subject. The proof of concept that nitrogen executions, though horrific, are legally permissible. His 4 minutes of convulsing became normalized. Expected side effects. His gasping for air became involuntary movements. The language sanitized the suffering, made torture sound clinical. Mike Sennett got his justice. His mother's murderer is dead. But watching Smith convulse for 4 minutes brought bittersweet feelings, not closure. The execution didn't heal anything. It just added more suffering to the original crime. Kenneth Smith spent 36 years on death row, survived one botched execution by lethal injection, then died slowly, painfully, experimentally in the first nitrogen gas execution in history. His case proves what death penalty opponents have always argued. The state cannot kill people humanely. Executions are messy, painful, brutal, torture disguised as justice. Alabama turned Kenneth Smith into history. But the kind of history that should make us question whether executions should exist at all. Kenneth Smith became the first person in history executed by nitrogen gas after surviving a botched lethal injection. His autopsy proved he suffered despite Alabama's claims. This is the reality of America's death penalty, experimental torture on human beings. If this story disturbs you, subscribe to this channel for more death row documentaries that expose the truth. Drop a comment. Should nitrogen gas executions be banned? Should Alabama face consequences for using Smith as a guinea pig? Thanks for watching. And remember, Kenneth Smith's 4 minutes of convulsing aren't an aberration. They're the system working exactly as designed, brutally, experimentally, and without accountability.